Well, thank you. As Sharon said, my name is Jessica Sayre. I'm the horticulture agent in Harrison County. And today I'm going to be talking about square foot gardening. So, not really sure who all in the audience has done this before, but I will say at the very beginning, there are lots of modifications that can be done with square foot gardening. We're just going to kind of give a guideline today. And I mentioned earlier, I wanted to, if she didn't hear me or if she wasn't on, but Beth in Pulaski County, I thank you because some of these pictures and some of this information came from a presentation that you shared with me a few years ago. So I appreciate the opportunity to use some of your stuff. We like to share in extension. So let me see. There we go. All right. So first of all, where can we grow plants? So anywhere that there is soil, okay? So in the ground, in containers, in cold frames, in raised beds. And then today we're going to specifically, of course, be talking about square foot gardening, which is an approach that is kind of trendy and also has a lot of really cool benefits to it. And within square foot gardening, you can do that in the ground or raised bed or different places. So the term square foot gardening, it comes from a gentleman by the name of Mel Bartholomew. He wrote a book about square foot gardening, which was the whole premise was grow more in less space, and you are gardening on a square foot. So it's on a grid, and we will get into all that, but each grid contains a set number of plants that you use, and we're going to be talking about vegetable plants specifically today. And is usually based on a 4 foot by 4 foot grid, which equals 16 units of growing space. And then the bed is often made of reused materials or materials that are inexpensive to acquire. So the principle of square foot gardening is it uses 20% less space to grow the same amount of food compared to your traditional row or traditional garden rows. And so hopefully you can see my cursor, but this is a 4 foot by 4 foot bed. And if you can see, there are some strings that are dividing this out into 16 sections, which each of these sections are 1 foot by 1 foot. So 1 foot squared, which is the square foot gardening intent. So you only need 6 inches of growing mix, 6 inches deep to grow plants in. This is according to his book. And there are going to be variations within this. Bagged compost from 3 different manufacturers is what he recommends, and we will get into the details of everything. And then the other principle associated with it is a 4 by 4 foot section. And the reason for that size is it is easily divisible, and you can also reach across. We've seen beds that, or you might have experienced your own raised bed or in the garden, that it gets really, really tight in there and you can't always reach what's in the center. So the 4 foot by 4 foot is one of the options that can be used for square foot gardening to allow you to be able to access all of those plants. So with any type of gardening, just some tips. The location close to the house is what we always say, because if it's out of sight, it's going to be out of mind. And usually that's when weeds take over. So closer to the house is better. The direction, we're thinking about square foot gardening is a way to grow a lot of stuff in a smaller amount of space. So we're going to think about growing up, as well as we are going to be putting different soil on top of our existing soil, like you would in any raised bed gardening. The soil mix, his recommendation is equal parts of peat moss, vermiculite, and a blended compost. So the box depth, anywhere from 6 to 12 inches deep, that's going to be a personal preference. Fertilizer in the square foot garden and raised bed gardening for that matter is going to require typically less fertilizer than traditional gardening. And then easy access, it is above the ground. So even though this isn't tabletop length or height to to where you can reach it without bending over, it is still a little bit easier to access. And also, anytime you have a raised bed like this, that can help you with weed prevention as well. So anytime you're building raised beds or any type of garden, keep in mind that we need aisle space. We want a comfortable width where we can walk in here and still have room to work. 3 to 4 feet between boxes is one of the recommendations. Some people, depending on your setup, you might have it large enough to where you can mow with your push mower or riding mower down in between. So it kind of depends on how much space you have, but you want to be able to get in here and access these plants on the different sides. Your aisleway, they can be just grass, they can be mulch, they can be rock, whatever your preference is for that. And then the grids, we talked about marking off the square footage area, and they can be permanent, which we will show some examples of that, or they can be something like that is string. And string is totally fine, but it needs to be visible, okay? Because whenever these plants get larger, that's going to be a little bit harder to see. But these are, they're very visible even in this picture. So you just want to know what your working area is. So if we are square foot gardening and we are seeding, so starting with seed, just a small pinch in each hole, and whatever the seed packet says, it depends on what you're growing as far as how deep and the spacing and all of that. But go along with the seed packet. And then as your seedlings start to emerge, you're going to want to thin out or snip out the weakest and keep the strongest, because in a square foot garden, we don't have a lot of space, so we need quality as opposed to quantity. So we can weed out those weaker seedlings and keep the strongest ones. So anytime you're gardening, I always suggest doing a plan for your garden. Just a little sketch is totally fine. Square foot gardening requires some more planning than traditional gardening does. And as always, I always say to start small. Gardening is a wonderful task, but it is still a task. And if it's very large, you might get a little overwhelmed. So definitely start small, and square foot gardening is a perfect way to start small. Don't forget, if you're going to have multiple beds, that you want to have aisles, and then draw it out. You can draw it out on just regular paper. I also really like to use graph paper, especially for square foot gardening, because you can literally make it to scale, and that can help you with your decision making as far as what to plant where. So I enjoy using graph paper, and that might be something, if you haven't done that before, to think about. So this is an example of our square foot garden. So here we have the box that is 4 foot by 4 foot, with each of these squares being a square foot. They're a foot, 1 foot by 1 foot. Depending on what you are growing, there are going to be certain amounts of that plant that you can grow within that square. And we will talk about this more as we go along. But for example, plant spaced 12 inches apart, such as an eggplant, you're only going to need 1 eggplant per square foot. If you've grown eggplant before, you know that it's large, okay, the plant itself. As opposed to down here in the bottom right-hand corner, plants spaced 3 inches apart, like radishes, they're going to be planted 16 per square. So in 1 square foot, you can either have 1 eggplant or you can have 16 radishes, because again, we're trying to grow as much in a small area as possible, and radishes are a lot smaller plant than an eggplant, so we can fit more into that area. And we'll talk more about that as we go along. And I don't know if it was in your email already, but if not, this presentation is available to you, and you can print it out and whatnot. And it's got some good, useful amounts that you might want to refer to. So the size of a square foot garden, again, according to the book, and there will be variations, is a 1 4x4 box would be enough salad for 1 person every day for the growing season. So that's a pretty handy little recommendation. If you add another box, you can supply the daily supper vegetables for that person. And if you add another box, having 3, you can supply with an extra everything. So you're going to have extra for preserving or for giving away or for specialty crops. So that's just a little idea of how much to grow, because sometimes we don't know where to start. The location I mentioned earlier, close to a house, close to your home, so you won't forget about it. So a convenient location. Gardens with vegetables, we need 6 to 8 hours of sun, clear of trees and shrubs, because we don't want the roots to get in the way. We don't want the shading of those trees to have an impact on our hours of sun that we get. No puddles after heavy rain, so we want a place with good drainage. And soil matters, but it's not going to matter. Your existing soil isn't going to matter quite as much, because with this, the recommendation is going to be to add some supplemental soil on top. So when you're building your box and structure, the bullet point here looks neat and tidy, and it really does. I really like the look. I'm all about square lines and 90-degree angles. I'm not a curvy person as far as design goes, so I appreciate this look. It is very organized, and it can help simplify what you grow. And then the size is predetermined. So it already has established limits for you. So again, we say to start small when you are gardening. Sometimes it's really, really easy to get bigger than you intended to. So this keeps you confined to a section. And you can see here in our raised bed that we've got, it's a 4x4, and these are the permanent structures that divide our different sections out. And so I mentioned earlier, they can be permanent, or they could just, you can be something that you switch out like string, but this is an example of permanent. And you can also see how there are different plants planted here, which we will discuss a little bit further. So that it's just a really interesting approach, especially if you're just a backyard gardener. So materials needed to make the beds can be made out of just about anything you can imagine. You can have lumber, you can have untreated lumber or recycled lumber. This picture here has concrete blocks. It can be leftover paving stones. It can be whatever you want to make it out of, whatever you have at your disposal. So then once you have your bed made, oh, I will mention too, this one is not a 4x4. And that's totally okay. In my, not where I live now, but where I lived previously, I had raised beds, and I had, what were they? They were 3x9. So that 3-foot wide and 9-foot long. I was able to buy a 12-foot board or 2 12-foot boards and get all 4 sides that way. So it was pretty economical to do it that way. And also the 3-foot wide, you know, you're very accessible to everything. So it doesn't have to be 4x4. That's just what the book recommends. And as I mentioned, we're going to have a lot of variation, and that's totally okay. So the materials to go within the bed, you can use your existing soil, but you can also use a mixture that is recommended in the book, which is all equal parts. So 1/3 sphagnum peat moss, which you can buy in large bales, and it'll go a pretty good ways for you. Compost, it's recommended from 3 to 5 different manufacturers, which seems a little bit overkill, but definitely you want, you know, 2 or 3 different kinds of compost, just so that you're getting a good variety of organic matter to get into your soil. And then vermiculite, and that's going to be a mixture of 1 to 1 to 1. A weed mat is also recommended, and we'll see a picture of that in a moment. So here we've got an example of our 4x4 bed, raised bed, and then this is a weed mat inside of here. So we want to, and I think this came from Beth's presentation, a little thought was to extend the weed mat out to here, 1 to 2 feet outside of the frame. And so then you're also helping with the weed control around the frame of the bed, which can be very helpful later on during the growing season. Because that weed-free perimeter is going to be helpful in reducing insect and disease issues, and it just makes it easier to get to the bed. So then here's an example of the different materials that we talked about with the compost and the peat moss and the vermiculite. And this is what they look like bagged. So this is the compost bags. There's 4 different kinds here. there's a big bale of peat moss, and then a bag of vermiculite. This is the vermiculite. If you're not familiar with that, it just aids in the soil with adding some drainage capabilities as well as water holding capacity, so that it gives the roots enough time to take up, to get all of the water that it needs without it being totally saturated. So the grids, you can have these slat type pieces of wood that make for good divisions, and they are for a more permanent structure. And of course, you want to put your soil, if at all possible, you want to put your soil in before you put the slats in. It's going to make easier for that. If you are doing the slats, this is just some pictures from the book that show some examples of drilling them together and attaching them permanently to the box. Another thing with square foot gardening, as well as any type of raised bed gardening, is you can use some supports. So maybe you've got green beans or something like that that you want growing, and we don't have a huge garden for it just to spread all over. So you could do something like a trellis to help those vining crops go up. And then in this picture, it's showing actually a frame that goes over top. And that could be used for a lot of different purposes. It could be used to cover with plastic during the winter months or whenever it's going to frost and you need protection. It could also be for protection of birds or varmints and different things like that. So this is a really easy thing that would be constructed, and also really easy to move on and off whenever the plants are smaller. Just another example of some structures here. And here is what I was referring to with the plastic. You got PVC pipe and plastic sheeting, and this can be protection from the cold. So if you're wanting to extend your growing season, which a lot of people do, this would be a really good option to be able to grow some, earlier in the year as well as later in the year than you would be able to otherwise. Okay, so pea and bean netting is another option. And then this, again, these are transferable to any type of garden, a traditional garden or a raised bed garden, but then, obviously square foot gardening as well. But the plants, hopefully you can see it, this green netting, the plants actually can grow up through that netting, and then they are supported. So instead of having a trellis, you have this netting and they can grow up through, and it can stay more supported for those taller plants. As I mentioned before, don't forget to put aisles in. We don't want to butt all of our gardens up right beside each other, because then they're going to be really hard to access. So material for in between the aisles, it could just be your grass. Mulch works well, gravel, straw. You just want to make sure if you have straw or hay that it doesn't have seeds in it, because that can be a problem. Walkways of stone or brick, leftover materials, or just you can leave it dirt. I mean, it's whatever you want to do, or what you have access to. But grass is always a good option because it's already there. So the soilless mix we've talked about, probably don't need this in here again, but it's 1/3 garden compost, 1/3 peat moss, and 1/3 vermiculite. And you can make your own, or you can buy it as far as the compost. And if you have a compost bin, I don't know if there's a class on composting or not, but these are just some things that if you have your own compost bin, that is totally fine once it is composted to use in your garden. That's one of the things it's used for. So some things that are good to have in that for the compost bin is straw, leaves, grass clippings, garden produce, eggshells, chicken manure or stable manure. You can use that, but be very careful whenever you're using that, because that needs to go through a composting process more so than these other items. And then some items that you do not want to put, that you do not want to put in your compost bin are meat and bones and grease and cheese and things that are not going to break down really easily, and also things that are going to bring varmints into your yard. We do not want that. So we can answer more questions later about the compost bin if you have questions specific to that. But you can make your own compost or you can buy it. So that was an example of if you were making your own, what to include in that bin. And then the other third is peat moss, which Comes in cubic foot. It can come in bags. It can come in bales like this. And so just an example, a 4x4 bed, then you're going to need 8 cubic feet. Multiply the width of your box and divide it by 2. And then that is going to tell you how big of or how much peat moss you're going to need. So once you get your peat moss and your vermiculite and your compost, then mixing it together before you put it in the box is going to be recommended. In this picture, we see a gentleman mixing it on a tarp, which makes it nice because you want to water that down. That's going to help your mixture mix better together. And it's also going to be very dusty. Peat moss is extremely dusty. So you're going to want to water that down as you go, and mixing it on a tarp makes it easier. And then you can move your tarp, you can drag it to wherever you're going. So it's a good option. You can also mix in a wheelbarrow. If you're like me, you're going to spill half of it if you do that. So that's, I guess, whatever your skill level is. I do better with the tarp. So now the part that you're probably wondering is, what am I actually going to plant and how is this different and all that good stuff. So you only want to plant what you're going to eat, and that is with any garden, okay? Because remember, sometimes it can get a little out of hand. So you only want to plant how much you're going to eat. 1 square foot can produce up to 1 pound of food, which is actually quite a bit if we think about it. Plant multiple squares with your favorite foods. You can stagger your plantings. We talk about this a lot with gardening. So I always use green beans as an example because it's really easy to get way more green beans than you want to deal with at one time, unless you're selling at a market or something, because that's a lot of breaking beans and that's a lot of canning. So maybe plant, some green beans, and then 2 or 3 weeks later, plant some more green beans so that you have succession. You have plants or produce coming on at different times and you're not getting all of it at one time. And then plan for a new crop after harvest. So if you have an earlier crop like lettuce, then in that square, you can plan to plant something else there after it warms up a little bit and the lettuce is done. You can also need to, or think about when you're planting by height. Think about the way that the sun is coming in. We don't really want to stagger all of our stuff. We don't want tall and then short and then tall and then short, because the short plants are not going to get enough sun. So if we can kind of do it on a slope with what needs what's going to get the tallest to the shortest, and planting those same height plants together, that's going to be more beneficial as far as the sun is concerned. So this comes, hopefully you can see it, it's a little bit blurry, but when we are talking specifically about square foot gardening, we are growing within a square foot. So for example, some extra large plants, one plant placed 12 inches apart. So within that 1 foot, you're going to have 1 broccoli, 1 cabbage, 1 pepper, okay? And then classified as large, 4 plants, and they're going to be 6 inches apart. So since it's 6 inches apart, we can plant 4 in there. So leaf lettuce, Swiss chard, marigolds, that there are some flowers in there. And then medium plants such as bush bean, spinach, and beet is 9 plants. Small plants that don't take up a lot of space, we've got 16 can go within 1 square. Carrot, radish, onion. So hopefully this can help you see that in a square foot, you can grow 16 onions. That's a lot. So for a very small space. And whenever I do anything with square foot gardening, as I mentioned earlier, the grid paper, if you're drawing things out, that can be really helpful for me to visualize. I have a hard time visualizing it without seeing it. So if I draw it out, that's very helpful. To know how much you can actually get. Okay, so here's another picture. Hopefully this can be a little bit easier to see. So kind of going backwards now, the smaller plants, just a drawing of kind of what it would look like in this 12-inch by 12-inch or 1 foot by 1 foot area. We can get 16 squares within that 1 square foot with things like carrots and radish and beets. And then down here are cucumbers that get a little bit larger. That's going to be 2 as opposed to 16. And that makes sense if we think about it. I will say that different resources will give you some different numbers. And they're not all consistent with how much lettuce you can grow in a square foot and how many peas you can grow in a square foot. So just use your best judgment and take notes. If this year it was like, oh, that's way too many, then we can knock it back for next year. Gardening is always a learning process. So in this bed, just a picture here, these are fingerling potatoes. So they were growing all one thing in here. And then down here, we've got some garlic that's over in this section, but it looks like this is empty. So maybe they're going to grow something else over here. So you can mix different plants, or you can, use it for all one item. It's totally up to you. So here we've got broccoli and cabbage, and then spinach on the corners, and then kale in the open spots. And I think this picture came from Beth. This might actually be Beth right here, but she's got weed fabric around the outside edges. And as you can tell, that really does help keep that barrier zone around your bed to help keep those weeds out. Just some more pictures here. We've got just a grid shape, and then and this one here, you can see it's larger than 4x4. Totally fine. It's whatever the area is that you have to work with. Down here, some more examples. Lettuce growing 4, and then onions. We've got 2 different types, but there's 8 of this kind and 8 of this kind, equaling 16. Lots and lots and lots of variation within that. And this is why I said that the presentation will be available to you if you want to print it out. You don't have to go buy the book, okay, unless you want to. But and there's all kinds of information online with the recommendations as well. But this just gives you an idea of what would go in the square foot garden. So 1 tomato per square foot, 1 pepper plant per square foot, but 9 onions per square foot. So that's just a little guideline there. I tried to show you different resources just because there is a little bit of variation between the recommendations, depending on who you read. Okay, so switching gears just a little bit. So now we know, these are kind of the amounts that we can plant, but are all of these plants going to do well together? In the square foot gardening realm of things, it is said that they will, for the most part. But one thing that I have to talk about in this presentation, because I think it is extremely important, is crop rotation of vegetables. So even within a square foot garden where we are growing a mixture of different things, or a raised bed garden, or a conventional in the ground garden, we've got to think about crop rotation. So changing the planting location of vegetables within the garden each season is what is recommended. That's not always possible, okay? To change out your tomato bed every year is a little difficult. But if you do change it out, it can help reduce damage from insect pests that are going to be reoccurring in that same area, limit the development of disease that is occurring within that same area, and can help manage your soil fertility. You might have a crop that's a heavy feeder that is sucking out all of the good nutrients. And if you use that year after year and you're not doing soil tests, you're not fertilizing, then you might end up with poor soil in that area just because of the crop that you grew there. So crop rotation is very important. Every year rotation is what is recommended. I personally don't know anyone that does that, because that would be a headache. So every 3 years would be great. If you can't do every 3, then try to at least do every 5. Because a lot of the questions that I get here at the extension office, and the other agents might say the same thing, get a lot of tomato questions. And we already in Kentucky, we have a lot of opportunity for disease anyway. And then if you're not planting a resistant variety, and then if you're planting in the same spot for 20 years, there's just a really good opportunity for something to go wrong. And crop rotation could have helped with that. It's a pretty easy management tool to do. So vegetables are classified by family, and each family is susceptible to similar insect and diseases. So they also have similar nutrient requirements. So if the same nutrients are taken from the soil year after year, the soil's quality will diminish. So just this also can vary depending on what resource you read, but I just wanted to kind of show you the different groups of related crops. And this is what I like to do as far as rotating my garden. So we've got group A: cantaloupe, cucumber, gourds, pumpkin, squash, and watermelon. Those are all related, okay, all in the same plant family. So if we plant these and plant them, 2 or 3 years in a row, well, then let's make a switch after like the third year and let's plant some stuff from group B. Okay, because and we can just swap places, okay, within our garden, whether it be raised bed or conventional or square foot. But let's just swap those out because this is a totally different plant family. They get different issues. So that way we're not carrying stuff over into the soil. So I like this chart that just kind of shows you the different families, and it's a way to help you organize your garden and to organize your thinking. So you can plant all of these, near each other, and then plant all of these near each other. And then whenever it's time to rotate, it's very simple just to put A where B was and B where A was. That's how my brain works anyway. So this is just another example of crop rotation. Vegetable crops in the same plant family should not be planted in the same, in the same area year after year. So we've got this recommendation. We have our legume crops, and then the next time we switch to root crops, and then we switch to fruiting crops, and then we switch to leafy crops, and then we go back to legume. And this is another really good recommendation for crop rotation. It can be complex or simple, depends on what all you're growing. You might only grow 2 or 3 things each year. A lot of people just do tomatoes, corn, peppers, and green beans, for example, but still, and a lot of those are related. So we still want to find a new spot, or we can try to do a little bit of rotation within that. But it can be a very complex system or very simple system, but change those locations annually, or at least 3 years is good. And definitely if you're not doing it 3, you need to do it in 5. You can also use cover crops, which is going to help your soil over the winter while that garden area is just chilling out in the winter. And you can also, if you don't have anything to rotate with, just leave your garden fallow for a season and just give it a little rest. Then do a soil test, see if you need any nutrients, and then we can plant something in there again. Light feeders, just a rule of thumb, light feeders follow heavy feeders. So tomatoes are kind of a heavy feeder, whereas lettuce is a light feeder. So lettuce would follow your heavy feeder. Deep rooted versus follow shallow rooted. And again, that makes sense. If you've got shallow rooted plants, then the next year you're going to follow with deep rooted plants. It just helps with that soil and keeping that structure, just helping your soil structure. 3 years between planting the same family in the same area is a much more practical recommendation than every year. So once we have our plants, and I'm sorry if I'm going over time, but it's just a lot to share, but we want to definitely water our plants. So we want to pay attention to our soil moisture. Too much water is just as bad as not enough water. And then we want to try, if at all possible, to water the roots and not the foliage. When we water the foliage, that is a good opportunity for disease to spread or sunburn to happen on the leaves on the hot summer days. So rather than a sprinkler up ahead, then let's think about using a soaker hose that's going to go directly onto the roots, or if you're using a watering can, watering around the root system, because the roots are what's taking up the water. That's where the water needs to go first. Then if we mulch can add a lot of good benefits. It can reduce water evaporation from the soil surface, which is really good during the summertime, especially when we've had some hot days like we have here recently and not a lot of rain. It may or may not reduce the soil temperature. It kind of depends on the area and a lot of other environmental circumstances, but it's a possibility. And then one thing it really does is reduces competition by weeds. It also can make weeding itself a little bit easier. And mulch can be a lot of different things. It can be mulch that you buy in a bag. It can be hardwood chips. It can be a lot of different things. It can be straw. Fertilizer. So a 10 or starter fertilizer is not a bad idea. However, I highly recommend that you get a soil test done. It can be done at any time of the year. You take it to your local extension office. Some offices have a fee, some cover the fee, but check with your local agent and see what they say. But we can see where we're at. And then you can also, you might not have to add anything, or the fall that we're coming up on is actually a really good time, because that gives you an opportunity if you need to spread lime, or if you need to do very much with the fertilizer, that you can have the opportunity this fall and winter to get that taken care of, and then the spring you'll be ready to go. You want to choose a water soluble fertilizer, so a fertilizer that dissolves in water. You usually only need to supplement nitrogen fertilization. So this 10 right here, this is N, P, and K, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. We don't always need all three of these. Okay, we usually need nitrogen, but we don't always need the other two. So that is why a fertilizer recommendation is good. Compost and organic mulch as sources of nutrients. If you're using that could alter your soil nutrition values. So again, getting a soil test is helpful, because we don't want to be using fertilizer if we don't need it. So some pest control, just some general quick things here. IPM is integrated pest management, and that is always the recommendation. The questions I get are, what do I need to spray? Well, sometimes there are other things that you can do prior to needing to spray. Sometimes we have to spray, but there are other options. So the one thing that you can do that is the number one recommended thing is plant resistant varieties. And through the University of Kentucky, we have resources that can tell you which varieties are resistant to certain diseases. So definitely plant resistant varieties, but I know you're not all going to, because a lot of you really like heirloom tomatoes and heirloom plants, and I totally get it, but just be aware of that. Employ good cultural practices like crop rotation, pulling weeds and not letting them go to seed. Scout, okay, especially for insects and diseases. So note the presence of the problem, and is it a beneficial insect, or is it an insect that we need to get rid of? We need to identify correctly and try to fix the problem if it is a problem early, because if it goes too far, then it's a real issue. And then you are going to have to spray. Okay, so scout daily so that you can see the issue early. And then practice the safest possible approach. So picking the Japanese beetles off your plant and dumping them in some soapy water, or squishing them, as opposed to spraying. Okay, because a lot of times that's just as or more effective. Just things to think about. If you are using a pesticide, please let others know, and always follow the directions on the label. They say that the label is the law. So you need to follow those directions. And if it's not supposed to be sprayed on that plant, don't spray it. And we're talking about vegetable crops here, so we all should really be mindful of that. We don't want to be ingesting something that we don't need to be ingesting. And then wrapping things up, cleanup and sanitation is one of the best things you can do for your garden. So clean up any fruit or vegetation afterwards that can help eliminate overwintering insect and diseases. Soil testing, now is a great time to do that. Incorporate organic matter. You can sow a cover crop. August is kind of the starting time for that, depending on if you're still in your garden or if you're wrapping things up. And then we can also plan for next year's garden. A lot of times by the 1st of August, we're just done. We're like, I've picked my last tomato. I don't want to do this anymore. And we just leave it. Where if we put a little bit of time and effort into the fall and get things cleaned up, we'll be in a better place to start in the spring. And that is all I have.